The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. With Africa's largest economy and population, Nigeria ranks among Goldman Sachs' Next 11, a list of countries the investment bank predicts will be among the world's largest economies in the 21st century. Yet for many Americans, this regional power evokes images of conflict and corruption rather than commerce. Despite a rich history as the seat of indigenous kingdoms and empires, the modern state of Nigeria, like many of its neighbors, has its origins in a colonial past. Here to help us understand how that legacy continues to influence events and what to look forward to for this African giant, we're joined by Dr. Chima Korieh, Associate Professor of History at Marquette University, where his research and teaching focus on colonial and post-colonial Africa. He also serves as editor of two scholarly journals, the Igbo Studies Review and the Journal of Transatlantic Studies. Dr. Korieh, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm wondering if we could start with just sort of a general background on Nigeria and give viewers some sense of just what it means in the regional context.
Well, I think Nigeria is certainly one of the most important countries in Africa, and not just in terms of its size, but it has a very large population. But it is also one that has a rich history and a country that has played really very important role in terms of the politics and diplomacy of Africa and its relationship to the rest of the world.
So, talk a little bit about that. I mean, sort of as a regional power right now, what kind of role has the present government and recent governments played?
Nigeria has been important in perhaps if we go back to the 1970s, and Nigeria has been important in terms of the liberation movement. It was important in really bringing the issues in South Africa during apartheid to the fore, and the attempt to establish black majority rule or democratic rule. Yeah, so Nigeria has been in the forefront of the liberation struggle in Africa, the peacekeeping effort in Africa. Beginning with the Congo crisis, the crisis in contemporary Western Africa, but also one that its economy and its trading relationship has benefited other countries in the continent in the past and at present.
So let's talk a little bit about that colonial history. I think we've got a slide here that shows a little bit about that history. It was a British colony for some time, and this is a map from about 1914, as we see, and there's very clearly northern Nigeria and a southern Nigeria. Talk a little bit about what that has meant historically.
The history of Nigeria, I think, has been really the history of various regional, alliances and their relationship with the British. Of course, with the British conquest of northern Nigeria in 1903, the colony and protectorate of what became the colony and protectorate of Nigeria began to take shape. But the process through which British colonialism was established in Nigeria was a very rocky one. It was much easier to establish British administration and colonial policy and structure in the North, because the institutions and structures in the North were already suitable for Frederick Lugar's indirect rule, and so the emirs and in the North were incorporated into the administration. So things, I think, to a large extent, were remained the same in many respects.
So there was a local administrative and governance structures that could just be employed by the colonial power, rather than stripped away and replaced.
Yes. So in a sense, you have a sort of collaborative hegemony between the existing elite, theocracy, of course, and the new British administration. So, but if you go down, I mean, as you go down to the South, it took many years to really pacify, to use that word, the rest of the country, particularly in the eastern region. So, because you didn't have institutions and structures of centralized governments and power and authority, so the British had to struggle, to conquer one village after the other. And it played a very important role in British attitude towards the different regions and peoples in Nigeria. Not only during their rule, but also in the post-colonial period. So British attitude towards the North was really that the North was a much more enlightened, people in terms of their structure.
These were Nigerians they could work with.
Yes, so they could work with the North. Right. In the West, I think also to a large extent, indirect rule did work, because they also had institutions and structures that were suitable for that kind of policy. But the Igbo, especially in the eastern region, was really the opposite of what you had in the North and the West. They were certainly very acephalous, in their structure, very Republican in terms of their political ideology. So the idea of king, chiefs, and was really absent here. The British went ahead to create what they called indirect, warrant chiefs, which really sometimes arbitrarily appointing people to become chiefs, right? So that structure, I think, and the sort of resistance you had in the East was important in terms of shaping British policy throughout the period. Of course, by 1914, the northern and southern parts of Nigeria were amalgamated into the country that became Nigeria. And of course, those were for administrative convenience and to, conserve resources. But the rest, I think, is history, because these are people who came from different backgrounds, different histories, different political ideology, and a different attitude towards, the colonial power and authority.
And had never shared a common identity.
Yes, yes, and it became even much more difficult in terms of fashioning out, as the British began to disengage, to fashion out what kind of nation state that Nigeria should be, right? And what kind of institutions and structures, that would need to be in place for the new nation. So it's been a difficult history from that period, because most of the people who make up Nigeria in terms of their ethnic ideology and orientation do not share the same vision of a Nigerian nation.
Well, we've got another map here. Maybe we could take a look at. You've touched on this. This is sort of broadly the kind of identities that people share. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Of course, this gives you some idea of the regional basis upon which the early colonial administration governed Nigeria. And, this of course had a lot of implications for the country generally later on. Most of the North, as you see here, were governed as the northern region, and then you have the eastern region, and then you have the western region. So the regionalism of course, with its attendant problems, became really important in terms of how the structure of the country was made, and institutions and structures were made. Now, I don't think regionalism is a really bad thing in itself, but because they are often based on different ethnic orientations and people grouped together, sometimes you have issues with minorities in these broad regions, the tendency for domination by the major ethnic groups, and also the sort of centrifugal and centripetal forces that would come to play later on in Nigeria.
So, sort of post-independence, what was the basis for this common Nigerian identity? I mean, what did successive governments try to do to promote that? That you no longer have your regional feeling as the basis of who you are, but you're Nigerian.
Mm-hmm. I think the problems Nigeria faced is the same problem many African nations faced in the post-colonial period. Certainly, you have the amalgamation of over 200 different linguistic, groups, and very early on, the issue of minority agitation, became important in terms of how these people see themselves, in relationship to the larger ethnic groups and regions. But of course, wisely, the attempt was made to create more states in order to reduce the larger implications and effects of the regions, and also to give a voice to the minority groups. But that in itself did not, I think, solve the central problem of the sort of federation that Nigeria became in the post-colonial period. You have this center that is very powerful. The regions have little or no power in terms of resource control, in terms of who dominates. So politics became who dominates the center, because who dominates the center also dominates the distribution of resources and the politics of resource control.
Well, and this is a frequent problem where the perception is it truly is a zero-sum game, so that if the representative of what I perceive as a different community is leading the government, it must, by definition, come at my expense.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can see that kind of issue within Nigeria right now, because for the first time you have a president that is from the South or the minority ethnic group. Most of Nigeria's history, the political leaders, and at least at the top of the political structure, have come from the North. But if you listen to the debate in Nigeria, there is a desire by most people from the North that power should return, to the North, because Obasanjo was there. He's from the South. Now is the turn of the North. I think it's really this sort of contestations for power and control is because of a faulty federal system that is in Nigeria. Because again, as I mentioned, the person who controls power controls a lot of resources and the allocation of resources. So people see the control of power in Nigeria as important in terms of what is allocated to them. So if he goes to the South, the North feels, cheated. If he goes to the North, the South clamors for, for power and authority. The East is arguing that they haven't been in position of power and control.
They haven't had their turn yet.
Yes, yeah. So those kind of, institutions and structures does not really sometimes, allow for merit and to run in the political process. But the geopolitical structure of Nigeria is what determines where power is allocated and what framework operates in the country.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about those resources, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about modern Nigeria with Chima Korieh, professor of history at Marquette University. Well, when we left for our break, we were talking a little bit about the sense that whoever controls the central government controls the resources. And let's talk a little bit about those resources. You know, the growth has been quite high. Nigeria is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in sub-Saharan Africa. So what is the basis of the economy right now?
I mean, there's been a shift, really a drastic shift from an economy dependent on the production of agricultural goods, particularly from the 1970s and onwards, to a dependency on oil. So oil is the most important source of revenue, Nigerian revenue, and of course also an important source of conflict in the country. There were times in the past when, you know, Nigeria was the largest exporter of palm oil and palm kernel. Most of the revenue, over 70% of the revenue, came from the export of agricultural goods. Nigeria does not export those goods again. The groundnut pyramids have disappeared. Cocoa has disappeared. Palm oil is no longer an important export.
Well, and I think that the agricultural production could be much more widely distributed across the country.
Yes.
Whereas oil is where it is. You can't find it somewhere else.
Yes, and I think also that in itself has that dependency sort of on oil for revenue means that, you know, Nigeria is vulnerable to, you know, changes in the oil market, and you know, lower prices means more crisis for, you know, the economy, and but I think most importantly that the wealth from the oil is not fairly distributed in the country. Most of those who control the oil, whether they are foreign or local companies, you know, do not distribute the resources to the generality of the population. So Nigeria may be the largest economy in Africa, but that does not translate into, you know, welfare, the welfare of the average citizen. There's still a lot of poverty, and a very, you know, small minority in the country controls the oil wealth.
So there are Nigerian 1%ers as we have them in this country as well. Well, let's talk a little bit about one of the groups that are very much in the news these days, the insurgency in Boko Haram. Now, they are in the north. And talk a little bit about the origins of that group and what they are ostensibly trying to accomplish.
I think Boko Haram was founded by Mohammed Yusuf in 2002, basically as a Muslim, I mean, as a fundamentalist, you know, group, and its goal, I think, initially was, I mean, it can be understood from the English translation of what it means, which Boko Haram means Western education is sinful or evil in Hausa. But broadly, I think the idea was to, you know, the formation of a group that would lead to the extension of the frontiers of Islam through jihad, but also in the process establish an Islamic community governed by the Sharia. And just like, you know, many other fundamentalist groups, its strategy is, you know, has often been through violence and just like the Taliban and in Afghanistan. So the idea of establishing a pure form of Islam was its major ideology, I think. And so initially the attempt was to, they did attack Christian churches, mostly in the northeast part of the country. But these days, I think they have expanded or extended the attacks to not just Christians alone, but they are attacking schools. Some of them, obviously, attended by Muslim students. Recently, they kidnapped over 100, school, girls from a school in the northeast. So I think it has become much more extensive in terms of attacking every aspect of a Western system or infrastructure in the country. And it's been much more difficult to contend with that because they have become much more sophisticated in terms of their strategies, and they are penetrating into areas that there was much more difficult for them to do in the past. And
in terms of just popular perception in the North, I mean, is this a relatively marginal group, or do they have wider or growing support, would you say?
I think initially, I think because the debate or the discourse in the North and most of really, beyond the North was that the roots of this crisis lays in understanding the sort of underdevelopment and deprivation, right?
So
from this community.
If you feel you are being marginalized by the central government and somebody is willing to come along and say, we're going to fight the central government and correct that maldistribution, the ideology beyond that may not be as important to you.
But I think in the case of Boko Haram, remember there's been some debate, within Nigeria about really negotiating with Boko Haram, just as the federal government did with the Niger Delta militants. But these are, I think people who have different ideologies and are people who whose stake in terms of the wealth of the country can be defined in terms of geographical and territorial terms. So Boko Haram, I think, in many respects, goes beyond the sort of economic deprivation and discourses that around it, but one has to understand it as a much more larger Islamist movement that is beyond Nigeria. Many look at it as even if they don't have a lot of foreign support, but to look at it as part of the larger Islamic movement in the Maghreb. And certainly Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, and the rest of West Africa is linked to, people in that region, especially in the north, are linked to each other. Centuries of ethnic relationships that cross across these nation states. So it's much, much easier for them to move across borders and carry out their activities in furtherance of the goals of extending the frontiers of Islam.
Well, we've got just a very few minutes left. I know we have an election coming up in Nigeria in 2015. What is the outlook, both politically and just in general?
Well, I think 1915 will be a test case for Nigeria in terms of understanding whether the institution of democracy in Nigeria can survive. Certainly, the politics of Nigeria is always influenced by ethnicity and the sort of ethnic dimension, which is becoming very loud in the country now. So there is, I think, an effort to ensure that power returns to the North. And that is, you can find in the sort of political realignments that has been going on, that a lot of people in the ruling party have moved over to the APC, which is a new party, including those, sitting members of the PDP. And that, of course, means that, significant support, for Jonathan in the north and in the west, that he had in the earlier election is disappearing. So, but the power, I think in many African countries, you got to understand the power of incumbency. How that is going to play out with the sort of concerted effort by the opposition to make sure that Jonathan doesn't, win elections in 1915 is still, out there. I can't predict really what would happen, but I think it would be one in which Nigerians have to sit back and basically decide if this nation has to survive or to disintegrate. The elections in 1915 will be an important mark of that.
Well, thank you very much for that fascinating insight. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,